On the last video, I talked about the wrestlers that ruined my childhood. And it got me to thinking, what if I was to list out the 100 scariest wrestlers of all time? You know how I like to do these 100 lists, and they basically have built my channel. And being that it's spooky season and all, let's go ahead and do this. Pro Wrestling Planet brings to you the 100 scariest wrestlers of all time. Before we get started, all I ask is that you please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like before you go. Let's get to it. Number 100, Vincent from Vincent and Dutch, currently in Ring of Honor Wrestling. Real name Vincent Marsiglia. Guy's been appearing for Ring of Honor since 2012 and has done stints in Impact Wrestling as well, and just recently made his way to All Elite Wrestling television. But the guy is rather spooky with his cryptic promos. Of course, they're very eerily reminiscent of Bray Wyatt, but hey, we're gonna give the guy a break. He's gonna go ahead and come in at number 100. I like the gimmick. I like his promos. I think there's a lot of potential here. Number 99, Braun the Leprechaun. Who is Braun the Leprechaun, you ask? Well, it's a gimmick that could have easily made my gimmicks list. In order to fill out this top 100, we had to kind of lean with some of the gimmicks that some would call rather cheesy. Some people know him as Dwayne Bruce. Some people know him as Sarge from the WCW Power Plant. Either way, this is a character that was briefly used by the Dungeon of Doom in 1995 or so. A lot of people would look at it as something pretty campy. I think it's rather creepy. I'm the Leprechaun. Number 98, Damien 666. I mean, come on, his name is Damien 666. I mean, what else do you gotta say? I mean, Leonardo Carrera Gomez, a Mexican luchador who's literally worked all over the world, in America, in Japan, etc. MW, ECW, WCW, you name it. Scary face paint, scary name. He deserves to be in the list. Number 97, Dexter Loomis. We first come to know Dexter Loomis as Sam Shaw in TNA Wrestling. Cut his teeth on the indies for 3 years before getting a shot with Impact Wrestling, or TNA Wrestling as it was known as at the time, but now it's going to be TNA Wrestling again. Anyway, TNA Wrestling. His time with TNA was kind of rocky. He was kind of sent back and forth between TNA and the development territory at the time, which was Ohio Valley Wrestling. And in 2015, he found himself back on the indie circuit, and he grinded the indie circuit for 4 years before finally getting a shot in WWE as part of NXT, as a part of this Dexter Loomis character. The gimmick was that Loomis had scary, lifeless eyes and would kind of creepily stalk people with those eyes before physically confronting them. Did the NXT thing, got released, was then brought back to the main roster 2023. His future status with the company is up in the air at this current moment, from what I understand. Number 96, Loch Ness. Like the Loch Ness Monster, get it? Born by the name of Martin Austin Ruane. This guy was mainly a British wrestler known as Giant Haystacks. This dude at one point weighed in earnest of 678 pounds. His lifetime of work on the heavy frame left him with knee problems and other complications, and by 1996 he was suffering pretty badly when he gets a call from WCW to come in and be Loch Ness. You know, like the Loch Ness Monster. He, like Braun the Leprechaun, was brought in as a random member of Kevin Sullivan's Dungeon of Doom to combat Hulk Hogan. This wasn't much outside of a few appearances, and very sad to note that actually, apparently, part of the reason why his run was cut short is because he was diagnosed with lymphoma. At that point, he returned back to Great Britain, which was his home, and then he died 2 years later in 1998. Number 95, Mantar. Mantar was better known by his mama as Mike Halleck. Halleck started wrestling in 1991 in Europe under the name Bruiser Mastino. Pretty quickly caught WWE's attention in about 1994. That's when they brought him in as Mantar. I guess he was supposed to be half man, half centaur. I don't know. And while some would look at it as goofy, I could see how him coming out in that moose mask would scare maybe like a 3-year-old or something at the time. WWE kept him under contract for a few years, and after the failed Mantar gimmick, he was mainly just kind of used as a spot guy, and then they sent him on stints to the USWA and ECW as well. He returned to Europe where he wrestled for years, in fact all the way until 2019, but sadly just died on July 11th, 2023 due to complications from diabetes. Maho Corone, don't really know much about her, just know that she dresses up creepily, and I was told that she should go into the list right about here. I don't know. Looking at the photos of her, I can see why this is probably justified. Number 93, La Parca, Jesus Alfonso Huerta Escoboza. This is kind of confusing, and I'm not going to kind of get into the ins and outs because there's a couple different guys that played the character. One of them had to stop using the name, and then the other one was known as LA Park. Bottom line is another spooky luchador, spooky masks, always acted a bit off, and everyone remembers him pretty good, so he should probably come right in here on this list. Number 92, the Barbarian. No, not Conan the Barbarian. I'm talking about Sione the Barbarian. Not gonna try to pronounce the rest of his name, so don't get on to me about that. He actually started out as being called Conga the Barbarian when he debuted in 1984. In 1987, he settled into the WWE as part of the Powers of Pain tag team and became known as just the Barbarian. At the tail end of that, in the early 90s, he was transitioned into a singles wrestler, a brief stint with WCW, then back to the WWE to be one of the head shrinkers, and back to WCW again to be one of the faces of fear with Ming. So a lot of different places, a lot of different ways this guy used to scare us. And apparently from what I can see, he still works from time to time. So there's that. I mean, if what I'm looking at right here is a semi-recent picture of him, he's 65 and he looks like he's in incredible shape. Number 91, Oz. In 1991, the Kevin Nash was presented with was more than likely the worst gimmick he had in his entire career. He was presented with Oz, as in the Wizard of Oz. You see, this dude would literally come out in a cape and in a wizard mask with silver hair and the hat and the whole thing. The wizard mask was very stoic and weird because it didn't move. I don't know. Take a look at this. Tell me it's not scary. Didn't help that they had a monster that they booked to lose a whole bunch, so it was hard to kind of take him seriously. And interesting thing to note, something I just learned, is apparently he even took this gimmick to Japan at one point, albeit briefly, so that would have been some interesting stuff to see. Maybe someone can let me know down in the comments whether they could confirm or disconfirm that. Number 90, Pentagon Jr. Born a day before me on February 5th, 1985. Hey, I can't find his real name anywhere, guess it's omitted. But I do know he was born in Veracruz, Mexico, but on record he has at least 2 younger brothers who are also professional wrestlers. Also been known by the name Dark Dragon, El Hayo del Cochillo, Penta El Zero, Penta Oscuro, Pentagon Dark, Pentagon El Om, Pentagon Jr., and Zayas. Are we sure this isn't Diddy under this mask? Pentagon has been at it since 2007, mainly in Mexico, of course, but was also featured on the show Lucha Underground, and from there was pretty prominent on the indies, also had a run in Impact Wrestling, pretty much everywhere, and recently he's landed in All Elite Wrestling since 2019. Number 89, The Natural Disasters. Yeah, I lumped him in as one entry, so sue me. I reserve the right to do that whenever I see fit on this list. John Tinta was around the WWF at the time as the Earthquake. An interesting fact, this team actually kind of weirdly started as an angle where Jimmy Hart was trying to get Andre the Giant to team with Earthquake. Well, Tugboat turned into Typhoon, hence The Natural Disasters. Almost a half a ton between the two guys. Both were legendary and infamous big man performers in one way way or another. Team was short-lived. John Tenta went on to be the Shark, as well as Golga. Typhoon went on to be the Shockmaster and gave us what's probably the most viral moment in all of wrestling history, even though it happened way before things went viral, but that's a whole other thing. Team split up in early 1993, but hey, interesting fun fact, they did kind of semi-reunite at WrestleMania 17 in the gimmick battle royal. Although Typhoon was in his tugboat gimmick, they were still in the ring together at the same time. Would have been cool to actually see a reunion at some point. We lost Tenta some years ago, but Fred Ottman, Cody Rhodes' uncle, still remains strong. And here in the year 2023, he's ages 67. Number 88, Sami Callihan. Callihan started his career on the Indies back in 2006. Used to bump around with a guy named John Moxley all the time. You ever heard of him? Worked hard on the Indies for about 7 years before getting a semi-big break with Ring of Honor. It was short-lived, however. The WWE finally got a look at him in 2012. In 2013, he signed a developmental contract where they turned him into Solomon Crow. He spent 3 years in the developmental system, and things were looking good, and then all of a sudden in 2015, he was released. He mainly makes the list here, even though he's not your traditional scary wrestler. He has that loose cannon attitude, and also a dangerous look on the inside and outside of the ring. He's done some stuff. I mean, just look at him. He's not like the other kids. Number 87, Giant Gonzalez. Jorge Gonzalez came to us all the way from Argentina. Jorge was an Argentine basketball player who got drafted by the Atlanta Hawks in 1988. Long story short, didn't work out with the Hawks, but he was in the Atlanta area, which was the same area as, you guessed it, World Championship Wrestling. So some way, somehow, he ended up getting his foot in the door there as just this huge giant. And they tried to put the square peg in the round hole and try to make this guy a wrestler. They brought him in as Elegante in 1989. By the end of 1992, WCW decided that there was no hope for the guy, but he did land on his feet and ended up with the job in the WWF, and they repackaged him as Giant Gonzalez. Elegante was a light-hearted giant. Giant Gonzalez was packaged as anything but. The guy was a savage and pretty intimidating for his size. But apparently Vince McMahon didn't think he was muscular enough, so he drafted up a bodysuit for him to wear that was made of naked muscles. Naked muscles. That was literally all the first suit had. And then someone said, hey Vince, maybe we should put a little bit of fur on it or something to kind of cover up some things. And thankfully they settled in on that. I always think back to WrestleMania 9 and when he put The Undertaker under the chloroform, and we thought that Undertaker was dead basically, but I mean, come on, he was already dead. Sadly, we lost Jorge in 2010 at the young age of just 44 years old. Number 86, Yokozuna. Famously a member of the Anawahi family, you know, like the tribal chief. He was born in 1966. He started getting his feet wet sometime around 1980. At his first big appearance for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987, did not debut for the WWE until 1992, where despite his Polynesian descent, he was marketed as a Japanese sumo wrestler. The guy got up to almost 600 pounds at one point, very intimidating, very scary, and was a huge player for the WWE in 1993-1994. Sadly, we lost him all the way back in the year 2000, and he was only aged 34 years old. Number 85, Spellbinder / Fantasio. Harry Del Rios first started appearing for the USWA in around 1993. Here he wrestled as the Spellbinder, and with his face paint was pretty intimidating, pretty scary. And since the USWA had a working relationship with the WWE, and he would be used on WWE TV every now and then, more often than not appearing as Fantasio, which was some sort of wrestling magician. It's like he took his Spellbinder gimmick and just kind of turned the creepy up a notch And then you have Fantasio. This is another one where it's like, yeah, it's kind of goofy, but also kind of scary at the same time. You know, because he's a freaky magician. I don't trust any magicians. You ever seen Chris Angel? About that one guy, that David Blaine, tell me he's not creepy. I mean, magicians are just scary. Enough said. Number 84, Gold Dust. The year was 1996, and then this came onto your screen. I think a lot of people were scared of it in one way or another. Either scared in the traditional sense or scared about how it made them feel. Either way, I think it did its job. Dustin Rhodes, famous son of Dusty Rhodes, Runnels, if you will. He was tired of playing son of a legend, so he and the WWE used the opportunity of him coming aboard to completely reinvent him and basically make him unrecognizable as Gold Dust. The gimmick crossed many boundaries for the time and definitely scared a lot of children. Somehow he was able to drag it out and be more and more bizarre over almost a 3-year time span. Then went to WCW, which we'll cover later, seemingly though always finding himself back in WWE as Gold Dust, and in later years the character would be much more lighthearted. Number 83, Prince Albert / Tenzai. Prince Albert, aka Matt Bloom, aka Lord Tenzai, began wrestling in 1997 and was a fixture of the global indie scene before being discovered by WWE and being brought in around 1998. That's where Prince Albert was born. This version of himself is scary enough, and oh yeah, all that hair. The hair alone was enough to give you nightmares. He hung out in WWE for 6 years under different variations of the same gimmick. They finally let him go in 2005, and from there he went to Japan where he was kind of a big deal, and based off of his success there as a monster, WWE decided to give him another shot, repackaged him as Lord Tenzai, a very menacing and intimidating monster, but it was nothing that we hadn't seen before, and soon WWE gave up on it and rebranded him into a comedy character with Brodus Clay as part of the Tons of Funk tag team. Go figure. Number 82, the Head Shrinker. They started teaming up in 1987 as the Samoan SWAT team, first in Puerto Rico, then in World Class, before finally ending up in World Championship Wrestling in the early 90s. Their most famous run probably though was with WWE as the Head Shrinkers. They came in 1992. Eventually, Samu was replaced by Sione, aka the Barbarian, who we already had on this list. Crazy, savage Samoans. It can be a pretty scary thing. Number 81, the Zodiac. Ah yes, Ed Leslie, the man of 1,000 gimmicks. Billed as Hulk Hogan's brother early in his career, caught on with the WWE in 1984 as he was Brutus Beefcake. In 1987, they turned him into a barber. Then when he went to WCW in 1994, he was known as the Butcher. And when the Three Faces of Fear eventually turned into the Dungeon of Doom, he was then rebranded once again as this gimmick known as the Zodiac. I mean, just take a look at this guy. You tell me that might not give you a nightmare a time or two? And what was even worse is the name, the Zodiac, which was very freaky in of itself. Spooky name plus spooky face paint equals one of the 100 scariest wrestlers of all time. In this case, number 81. Congratulations, Ed Leslie. Number 80, Bastion Booger. Bastion Booger was born Mike Paul Shaw in 1957. Now, this wasn't the scariest incarnation of himself, but it was dang sure one of them. He was first known as Klondike Mike. Then sometime in 1984, he took on the name of Mahan Singh. Started out doing a lot of stuff in Canada, mostly with Stampede Wrestling. In 1989, he joined WCW as Norman the Lunatic, which you better believe is going to be on here somewhere. Then he was briefly Trucker Norm and a few other weird names. When he finally started getting his check signed by Vince McMahon, though, he was known as Bastion Booger. Well, not quite. See, he was actually Friar Ferguson first, but that's besides the point. So I could point out a couple obvious obvious things here when you're taking a look at this guy. Obviously the teeth, maybe the bald head, or maybe it was the adult diaper suit that he was basically made to go out there and wrestle in. Who knows? He was let go from WWE sometime in 1994, and sadly this is another one we lost in 2010, just 53 years old. And this list is kind of turning out to be scary in a different way. Number 79, Joe Gacy. The guy was born Joseph Ruby, decided to change his name to Joe Gacy. You know, Gacy, kind of like the serial killer guy. Get it? That's scary, right? This dude spent the majority of his career up to this point in combat zone wrestling, which is scary in of itself. A good 16 years on the indie scene before finally landing a development contract with the WWE and settling in on NXT. He spent a good 3 years there now at this point. Gotta wonder what the future holds. I guess you could say overall his in-ring style pretty scary. Also has the creepy cult vibe thing going on like we've talked about in a few different entries here. You all know who we're talking about. Number 78, the ECW Zombie. Real name Timothy R. Calkins. Was born in 1975. Spent most of his time working as Tim Arson. Best known for these weird cameos in ECW as the ECW Zombie. WWE CW, if you will. I don't know how this got so high on here. Must have been an oversight. He worked in Puerto Rico a lot other than that, and he died in 2015 at the age of 38. Man, what is going on? Not even trying to do a bit here. Like, this is not cool. Is anyone still alive on here? Like, I'm starting to think there's some kind of weird connection between scary wrestling gimmicks and mortality itself. Number 77, 7. We talked about Dustin Rhodes earlier as Gold Dust. This time he appears in the countdown as 7, which is hands down probably his worst gimmick, but also his most scariest. This was a very brief run of vignette. Pretty sure these were captained and directed by Vince Russo himself. If your idea of promise is Dustin Rhodes stalking children outside their window with a cowboy hat on, but hey, all the creepy vignettes all added up to, you guessed it. No, you probably didn't guess it. 7 shows up on his first day of work and declares that his gimmick sucks, and he knows that it sucks and he's not gonna do it anymore. So someone smartened up somewhere along the way. Still pretty scary though. Number 76, Freddy Krueger. Pretty simple thing here, really. Freddy Krueger, of course, movie character that haunted kids' dreams in the 1980s. Then you've got Doug Gilbert, brother of Eddie Gilbert, who for whatever reason decided to adopt this persona before going to Japan one time. There's a lot of Japanese audiences that really love this sort of thing, even still to this day. And I don't think this is going to be the last horror character that we see on this list. You see that? That's called foreshadowing. I paid attention in English class a time or two. Number 75, Leatherface. Michael James Pinzel, probably best known across the board to wrestling fans as Corporal Kirchner. This guy was literally just working as a mechanic and a bouncer in Minnesota when he ran into Hulk Hogan, and I imagine it went something like this. Hey brother, I think you'd be a pretty good wrestler, dude. And apparently he introduced him to Vern Gagne, and the rest was history. Before going to Japan and adopting the persona of, you guessed it, Leatherface. See, because there's a small group of Japanese audiences that really love that sort of thing. You know, because Leatherface is also a horror, icon and wrestling in Japan, and speaking of which, number 74, Dr. Luther. Lynn Olsen came onto the wrestling scene in 1988. Got his start there in Canada before going to Japan. This is where probably the scariest stuff of this dude's career took place. You were able to get a hold of a hardcore Japanese wrestling tape back in the 90s. Chances are you saw Dr. Luther on there. The guy looked scary enough, but he would also do some insane things in the ring. A lot of blood involved, of course, but still was a very obscure name on the wrestling scene. That is probably until semi-recently. All Elite Wrestling brought him in 2020 and actually used him quite a bit. So a lot of present-day wrestling fans also are introduced to the guy. I would say this is probably a more tamed down version overall, but still looks pretty scary. And last I checked, still with All Elite Wrestling. So number 73, Willow Will-O-the-Wisp. So basically, this is an early name for Jeff Hardy early in his career. Was used very briefly, but he basically brought this character back during the team's last run at Impact Wrestling back in 2015, 2016 or so. It was all part of that final deletion era. They brought the character back as simply Willow. Basically supposed to be Jeff Hardy in his darkest form. When he did appear on camera, obviously super scary. They tried to do a lot more with it and tried to make it an actual running character that worked not only in dramatic instances but also live in front of audiences. I don't know, there's not much to say about it other than that. Come across it though, pretty spooky. Number 72, Damian Priest. Luis Martinez first started wrestling in 2005, wrestled for a whole 10 years before finally getting a look at by Ring of Honor, and there he was Punishment Martinez, and especially in these days, new on the scene, was definitely very scary, very intimidating. It didn't hurt matters that he was pretty much booked as a monster by Ring of Honor. It was almost one of those things where when you finally did hear him talk, it was almost like, man, I wish he would have never talked. It's not that he has a bad voice, but it's just not really a scary voice, you know what I mean? After 3 years of Ring of Honor in 2018, Martinez signed with WWE and went straight on to NXT. That's where he was rebranded as the Damian Priest character that we know today, and by 2021 he was called up to the WWE main roster, where he's presently in the Judgment Day faction. You may have heard of it. And the man still, along with the whole group, you could say is pretty scary, besides Dominic Mysterio, of course. Number 71, Hallowicked. Born Robert Goodwin in 1981, been scaring people in Shakara for 18 years, since 2002. Always involved in some sort of spooky shenanigans. If you're a Shakara person, you'll get what I'm saying, and you'll get why he's on the list. If you're not, then you'll probably be upset with it. I really don't care either way. No one has to worry about being scared by him anymore, though, because he retired in 2021. Number 70, Nick Gage. His real name is Nick Wilson. He was born in 1980. Put it simply, this guy started out as a backyard wrestler. Always had an affinity for the hardcore style, so he transitioned perfectly into Combat Zone Wrestling in 1999. Spent a good chunk of his career there, was pretty much the base of his career as he toiled around in the indies for years and years and years. Arguably the most famous current American deathmatch wrestler that there is. Kudos to this guy, because if you ever hear him talk on any kind of show or promo or anything like that, like, this guy may be the last line of real kayfabe in the business today. It's one of those things where you can't really say he's a work, because the guy definitely lives his gimmick. Number 69, Kevin Thorne. Kevin Fertig was born in 1977 and started his wrestling career in 2000. Spent his first couple years working the Memphis circuit before getting called to Ohio Valley Wrestling, which at the time was the breeding ground for the WWE. By 2004, he was called up as Mordecai, which we'll get to in a second. That didn't quite work out, so he toiled around in the system for the next couple years before finally being repackaged as Kevin Thorne, a wrestling vampire. Really wasn't a big deal, because we had seen wrestling vampires before, and arguably much scarier ones at that. He did have Shelly Martinez as a valet, though. The gimmick didn't last too long, as it was synonymous with the rebrand of WWE's version of ECW. After this, he was sent back to WWE's developmental system, and just nothing ever panned out for him before he just got released. Speaking of which, number 68, Mordecai. This was the gimmick that Fertig held prior to the Kevin Thorne gimmick when being called up to the WWE main roster. The Mordecai gimmick was basically Fertig's 7 gimmick with just some alterations, especially on the look. Vince McMahon basically, I guess, wanted to portray him as a godlike figure, hence the white hair everywhere. And I had to put it in front of the Kevin Thorne gimmick because I think it was just a little bit scarier than the kind of lame vampire gimmick that he was doing, you know what I mean? Number 67, Max Payne. Daryl Peterson was born in 1961. He started out working for WWE in 1987, quickly went to Japan and spent time in a dojo with Chris Benoit. Didn't know that before today. From 88 to 92, he bounced around all over the place. The UWF, the AWA, the CWA, before finally landing in WCW in 1993. He was a menacing character who dressed spookily and played guitar and looked just like every spooky neighborhood drug dealer from the 1990s. He then went to WWE to be Man Mountain Rock, which wasn't quite as scary. He then retired in 2004. Number 66, Mariposa Moth. To know this entry, you have to know the somewhat obscure show Lucha Underground. Mariposa Moth was a part of the Moth tribe with Marty the Moth Martinez. That's about all the info I got, but number 65, Marty the Moth. So this is piggybacking off the entry earlier, of course, but hey, once again, it is my list here. So Mariposa was supposed to be Marty's sister, and they were a part of the Moth tribe, and they were spooky on their own. They were even spookier together. Martin Casal, born in 1985, started in 2003, was on the revived Tough Enough show back in 2011. If you go back and watch those shows, he was definitely a shoe-in to win the contest before injuries would prevent him from moving on. After that, he landed in Lucha Underground with this Marty the Moth character, which I thought was great, very, very underrated. He got a small look from AEW recently, but that hasn't transpired into anything major. But as far as I can see, still continues to be somewhat active. Number 64, Killer Cross. Born Kevin Kazar in 1985, WWE fans know him nowadays as Karrion Kross. He debuted in 2014 and quickly gained the attention of Jeff Jarrett and Global Force Wrestling, and he started there in 2015. From there, he spent a few years in Lucha Underground, indie stuff, Impact, MLW. The guy had pretty much been around. In 2020, WWE finally gave him a call, brought him up to NXT as Karrion Kross. Quite the body of work, but even if you're just familiar with his WWE work, that resume alone, I think, puts him in the list right here. Definitely one of the scarier, creepier acts of modern day WWE. Number 63, Bull Nakano. She was born in 1968, began wrestling in 1983, spent 13 years in All Japan Pro Wrestling before branching out. She spent a little bit of time in CMLL before landing in the World Wrestling Federation in 1994. They brought her in as the antagonist to Alundra Blaze. They had some pretty good matches, but unfortunately there wasn't much of a women's division outside of the two of them, so her ceiling was very limited here in America. She appeared in WCW a couple times after that, but then called it a day in 1997. And from the Bet You Didn't Know file, after that she became a professional golfer. Number 62, The Shark. We first talked about John Tenta as part of the Natural Disasters tag team as Earthquake. When WWE was done with him, he moved to WCW and became the Avalanche. And then after the transition to the Dungeon of Doom, he became The Shark. And I think it's tied for probably his worst gimmick, but also the scariest as well. I mean, really, what would you do if you saw this guy in a dark alley somewhere? Eventually, he would come to his senses and realize that he wasn't a shark, he's a man. Number 61, Zeus. Tommy Lister Jr. was born in 1958. From what I can gather, he was pretty much a guy that WWE found in Hollywood at the time of filming the No Holds Barred movie with Hulk Hogan. He was cast as the intimidating monster wrestler in the movie who opposed Hogan, and his performance was so scary, I guess they thought, hey, we might as well actually try to get this guy in the ring. Your classic thing of sticking a guy in a tag team match and protecting him, and they pulled it off. No one would have ever known, and Zeus was pretty dang scary altogether. I always wondered why he wasn't around more and they didn't use him more outside of the little thing with Hogan, and the answer was pretty simple, is that because he wasn't a wrestler, he was an actor, which aren't they all in a way? Notably though, he did have a match with Abdullah the Butcher in Puerto Rico, which I'm sure was lit, and then WCW brought him in 1996 to oppose the Hulkster once again, because that was something that Eric Bischoff just loved to do at the time. Most will probably remember him though as Debo from the Friday series. Sadly, we lost Lister in 2020. Number 60, Hakushi. Real name Kensuke Shinzaki. Was born in 1966 but began his his professional wrestling career in 1992. He debuted in a promotion called Universal Lucha Libre, and from there went to Michinoku Pro for a couple years before coming to the WWF as Hakushi. The imposed tattoos over the body were a part of the aura, as well as being a silent warrior. At the time where WWE had a lot of goofy type of scary gimmicks, this one was actually not really meant to be scary or goofy, but ended up being one of the scariest, if that makes sense. Number 59, Waylon Mercy. Daniel Eugene Spivey was born in 1952 and debuted in the world of wrestling in 1983. He was a Florida guy and he toiled around with Jim Crockett Promotions as well. That was early on. He ended up in the WWF by 1985 and did about a 3-year run there. After that, he pretty much split his time between Japan and wrestling in NWA/WCW. In 1995, WWE brought him back as Waylon Mercy, which famously enough was a gimmick that was based off of Robert De Niro's character in Cape Fear. Was a personal project for Vince McMahon and could have been something really huge. Didn't really get off the ground though due to Spivey's injuries, and he would pretty much retire shortly into this run. These promos that he cut though ahead of their time, and of course a huge influence on what would become the Bray Wyatt promos years later. Number 58, the Road Warriors, the second tag team we see inducted on the list here. They started in Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1983, gave the team some time to develop. One of the most legendary tag teams, not really someone we need to do a whole lot of explaining about. I'm going to use this time to just justify the fact that the Road Warriors belong in this list because they were absolutely scary. Just ask any of their opponents from the 80s that were lined up against them in the ring, looking straight out of a Mad Max film with the shoulder pads and the spikes and the face paint, not to mention what they would do to guys in the ring. Number 57, the Sinister Minister. James Mitchell, and that's actually his real name, was born in 1965. First started appearing in wrestling in the Carolinas in about 1989. And I know what you're thinking, this is actually the first non-wrestler manager on the list. Be that as it may, he was first acclimated on a national scale in WCW in about 1996 when they brought him in as the manager of Mortis. There he was known as James Vandenberg. After that run ended, he ended up in ECW as Father James Mitchell, aka the Sinister Minister. That gimmick has stuck with him to present day, and he's used it in virtually every company since then. Everything from TNA to Impact, AEW, the NWA, and so on. Number 56, Umaga. Edward Fatu was born in 1973 and first debuted in wrestling in 1995. During this time, he was known as Eddie Fatu and Ekimo, and then later Ekimo Fatu. You probably first got to know him though as Jamal in the 3-Minute Warning tag team on WWE back in 2002. That lasted a couple years, and then he was expelled out onto the indie scene and did a lot of work in Japan for a couple years. He returned to WWE though in 2006 as Umaga, a new, more even intimidating character with the facial tattoos, was booked as a monster and had an undefeated streak and a long main event run with John Cena. It's kind of the same thing like the Road Warriors, just stand across the ring from the guy. Sadly, we lost him in 2009 at the age of 36. Number 55, Matanza Cueto. Jeff Cobb was born in 1982, started wrestling in 2009, worked the indies for a total of 5 years before getting noticed by Lucha Underground, and that's where they brought him in here as Matanza Cueto, who was basically the big supervillain boss of the show, big menacing guy under a mask, and he dominated pretty much everyone and didn't speak a word while doing it. The strong but silent type, you know what I mean? You can still make the case for him even today as just regular regular old Jeff Cobb as being one of the most intimidating presences in professional wrestling since Lucha Underground closed down, but a main staple of the American indie scene, as well as a big deal in Japan, also been used extensively by Ring of Honor and All Elite Wrestling. Probably one of the most high-profile technical free agents there is out there today. And scary. Number 54, Sid. Sid Udy was born in 1960 and first started wrestling in 1987. Started out in Continental Championship Wrestling and also did some Japan stuff. As a member of the Skyscrapers in 1989, even had a brief stint in the Four Horsemen, was one of the biggest monsters you could find in the business at the time. So much so that in 1991, Vince McMahon ponied up the big bucks to bring him up north. Sid was the kind of guy that just when you think you had seen it all, just when you thought he was the most scariest, he would one-up himself. And that's what he did with the WWE run, but he bounced around quite a bit. WCW to USWA, back up to WWE, then back to WCW, whether it was Sid Vicious, Sid Justice, Psycho Sid, or just Sid, he created so many either scary or memorable moments for us in one way or another. Plus, we had real life stories about the guy attacking people with scissors and stuff like that, and squeegees. Number 53, Kazarny. Nicholas Chevekovich, don't know if I said that right, sorry, was born in 1973 and debuted in wrestling in the year 2000. Cut his teeth on the indies for 6 years. However, he did have some sporadic appearances for TNA Wrestling during that time. In 2006, he was finally given the call to come to the WWE and given a character named Kazarny. He actually signed his development contract with WWE in 2007. He was brought to FCW as Sin Bodhi, and then they thought up the Kazarny character for him to come up to the main roster. It was something that was very rushed for whatever reason, and then it was here and gone. We got a bunch of creepy vignettes, which were probably the scariest part of it all. We got a debut, a few matches, a cup of coffee, and he was out of the WWE. He now roams the indies again as Sin Bodhi and still active to this day. Number 52, Evil. Chiaki Watanabe. I probably didn't say that one right either. He was born in 1987, started wrestling in the year 2011. I'm not going to pretend like I know a whole lot about Japanese wrestling, but I just know that this dude Evil is a bad dude. Mostly a New Japan wrestler, but has made sporadic appearances in America over the years. Years ago with Ring of Honor and more currently with AEW. Known as the King of Darkness, what more can you say? The guy's name is Evil. Number 51, Crazy Steve. Real name Steven Scott, and born in 1984. He began wrestling in 2003. This guy worked for a whole 11 years on the independent circuit before finally getting a chance with Impact Wrestling. In 2014, he debuted as part of the Menagerie stable, and from there transitioned into probably his most famous work with a stable called DK, which also included Abyss and Rosemary, and was one of the most over acts in the company at that time. In 2017, Crazy Steve ended up parting ways with Impact Wrestling for whatever reason. Shortly after that, it was found out that he was dabbling with WWE tryouts and so forth. That didn't quite work out, so then he went back to the indies for a while, but actually found his way back to Impact Wrestling in 2020. I mean, just take a look at this guy. He definitely wasn't like the other kids either. Number 50, Alexa Bliss. She was born Alexis Kaufman in 1991, and Alexa is a straight WWE product herself. She was signed to the WWE Performance Center with no prior training or wrestling experience whatsoever. This happened in 2013, and a short 3 years later, she was the SmackDown Women's Champion. I think everyone's pretty familiar with her, so this entry is mainly focused around one section of her gimmick, and this of course has to do with her time spent as one of the characters involved in Bray Wyatt's Firefly Funhouse house along with The Fiend. Alexa basically performed the gimmick of some sort of lost demonic child, and it made for a lot of creepy segments. Some people are a fan of it, some not so much. I thought they were interesting, at least. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Number 49, Alistair/Malachi Black. He was born Tom Budgeon in 1985, and he's actually Dutch. I don't think we should hold that against him, but started his career on the European scene as Tommy End in 2002. By the 2010s, he was a pretty high-profile independent star who had made several stops over here in America, and by 2016, he was signed to WWE and NXT, and after a good 5 years there of trying his damnedest, he ended up leaving for All Elite Wrestling, hence the change from Alistair Black to Malachi Black. At the end of the day, what makes him scary is his semi-Satanist gimmick. No one really knows what any of it means, but it sure is scary. Number 48, Crowbar. Crowbar was born Christopher Ford in 1974. He trained under Iron Mike Sharp and began wrestling in 1992. Busted his tail in that 90s indie scene for about 5 years. He spent all this time under the name Devon Storm, and by 1997 he finally landed a deal with the World Wrestling Federation, although they didn't really do much for him at the time. He was thought to be a part of their light heavyweight division, but ended up like more of an afterthought. He found himself in WCW in 1999 here as Crowbar, an out-of-control maniac that people were pretty sure escaped from a mental asylum somewhere. Him and David Flair and Daphne were a trio of schizophrenics who got along with each other, basically. When WCW closed down in 2001, he didn't exactly end up working for WWE, so he's been on and off the indie scene ever since then. You carry a crowbar, your name's Crowbar, you talk to yourself, you're gonna end up in the list. It's just really that easy. Number 47, Necro Butcher. Born Dylan Summers in 1973, Necro got his career started in 1998. He had a bunch of different names, including Michael Van Slick and Private D Summers. Before the Necro Butcher thing and the hardcore thing, deathmatch thing started taking off. So this guy has had quite a run throughout the 2000s as a deathmatch wrestler, but he wouldn't only do death matches, he would do some actual wrestling from here and there as well. But of course, that's what made him the scariest, is his willing to just get in there and get bloodied. The most famous example of this is you can see him in the 2008 movie The Wrestler, doing exactly what he was famous for, stapling guys' heads and the whole bit. He first retired in 2016, but has since came out of retirement several times, and from what I've gathered here, it looks like in 2020 he was diagnosed with lymphoma, but has since recovered from that. Says he's even been in the ring as recently as 2022, so Necro Butcher still going strong at age 50. Number 46, the Wyatt family. Alright, hold on. Before y'all accost me here with this, let me make one thing clear. This induction is for the family itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to lump in the 3 other guys that were a part of the family. That means Luke Harper, aka Brody Lee, Eric Rowan, and yes, even Braun Strowman get credit for being a part of the extended Wyatt family. Bray Wyatt, the leader of the outfit, well, we'll get to him later. We definitely had to rank him higher. These other 3 guys, though, definitely played their parts very well. I mean, who didn't have a nightmare over that sheep's mask? So then sometimes you'd see a scary black sheep mask. I think I've played my case well enough. Number 45, the Great Khali. Born Dalip Singh Rana in 1972. Earliest known instance of him wrestling is in the year 2000 with All Pro Wrestling as Giant Singh. And fun fact, something that I just learned today as well, fans. His first American contract was actually, strangely enough, with World Championship Wrestling. This happened a little short of a year from the company being bought out under Vince McMahon. For whatever reason, they passed on him at that point, and he ended up doing some stuff in Japan for a while. Then he did some stuff in Mexico, and then in 2005, and then right at the beginning of 2006, WWE said, finally, okay, we'll go ahead and sign you to a contract. After about 5 months, they decided that they had seen enough, and he was brought up to the main roster, and of course, booked like an unstoppable monster from day one. I mean, why wouldn't you, just take a look at this guy. He really held it down as the main monster heel in WWE for a good 2 to 3 years. Eventually they got tired of it, turned him into a comedy character like they do a lot. Now he runs his own wrestling promotion and school in India, and he's still semi-active to this day apparently, so still scaring people. Gotcha. Number 44, the Kiss Demon. This is a weird one. Born Dale Torborg in 1971. He was initially a baseball player before injuries derailed that. In 1995, he started training to be a wrestler. After that, he ended up in the WCW power plant. And just to make a long story short, basically, Kiss had a deal with WCW to possibly have a whole stable of Kiss wrestlers on board. They originally wanted this character to be portrayed by Bryan Adams, but it ended up being portrayed by Dale Torborg here instead. It also centered around a big concert that Kiss was going to have on Nitro. The concert bombed, people were confused by the wrestler, and eventually just kind of fizzled out. He just became the Demon. As a scary wrestler, I mean, come on, it has all the ingredients. You have the spitting blood, you have the Demon name, you have the face paint. You're pretty much ready to go from there. Torborg eventually retired in 2021. Number 43, the Great Kabuki. I really wanted to rank this guy higher. Familiarity purposes, though, kind of bumped him down in this range. Was born in 1948 and debuted in wrestling in 1964. He also went under a few different names, but we'll just kind of group this all together as one induction here. This guy may have been the first guy to ever blow the mist in someone's face, which now just seems like a time-honored tradition and birthright, really. A lot of fans will remember him from World Class or Jim Crockett Promotions, perhaps. He did have one sporadic appearance with the WWF with the 1994 Royal Rumble entrance, and like most wrestlers, they may slow it down over time, but it's really hard for them to actually stop. He was wrestling all the way at age 70 in the year 2018. Wrestling, it might be the fountain of youth. Number 42, Big Van Vader. Born to Leon White in 1955. This guy was drafted by the Rams in 1978, but injury problems cut his football aspirations short, so he began wrestling training and debuted in 1985. He spent his first couple years learning in the American Wrestling Association. From there, he sojourned to Europe for a few years, ended up in Japan in around 1987, and by proxy off of that, most fans probably saw him appear in World Championship Wrestling with everyone else around the year 1990. Probably one of the biggest, scariest bad guys that WCW had at the time. He'd come to the ring wearing that huge helmet that was real freaky, and then he'd set it down in the aisle and it would blow smoke. You remember that? By 1995, he and WCW had parted ways. After doing a couple other things here and there, he was finally ready to come to the World Wrestling Federation, and he was in the WWE for a good 3 years, which I'm telling you seemed like a decade if you lived through it. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. It just kind of never got off the ground in WWE though, for whatever reason. We would hear a lot of rumors that Vince McMahon just thought he was too fat. I don't know. From there, just like most wrestlers, career slowed down but didn't quite actually stop. Who knows how long he would have went if he could. He wrestled his last match at the age of 62, but died a year later in 2018 at the age of 63. Number 41, Ming. Tonga Fafita was born in 1959. Actually first started out as a sumo wrestler, but then transitioned that into pro wrestling and started doing that around 1978. He was first King Tonga, and then WWF audiences in the 80s came to know him as Haku. Did all kinds of stuff for years, but was always just kind of like a guy. He lands in WCW in 1994, where they rebrand him as Ming, and this guy was legitimately scary. Dungeon of Doom, no Dungeon of Doom, Faces of Fear, or no Faces of Fear. I mean, this guy would legitimately destroy guys. You ask anyone from those locker rooms back in those days, and they would say that probably the most legitimate tough guy in there was Ming. Anyway, I've made my case. Legit tough guy, legit scary, belongs on the list. Number 40, Abaddon. There's not much really known about this person. We know that they started wrestling around 2019, and we do know that was trained at the Rocky Mountain Pro Academy. Most this person from their appearances on AEW Wrestling, and while they have been sporadic, just one look at these graphic images here tells you all you need to know about Abaddon and how scary they are. Number 39, Rosemary. Holly Letkeman was born in 1983. She's Canadian. I don't think we should hold that against her, but she began training for wrestling in 2007. A lot of people may know her from Shimmer and around the 2010s. More than likely, though, even more people know her from her time with Impact Wrestling as Rosemary. She was a part of the Decay group, which we discussed with Crazy Steve earlier. They brought her back through Impact a few times, and since this is her most notable gimmick, this is pretty much what she uses from what I understand, and she's still active today. Still out there scaring people. She wasn't like the other girls. Number 38, Vampiro. Vampiro was born Ian Hodgkinson in 1967. His wiki page says that he was a bodyguard for Milli Vanilli before wrestling, but I don't see how that can be true. The timeline of that seems bizarre because it says he started wrestling in 1984, and Milli Vanilli was more of like a late 80s, early 90s type thing. Claims he was trained by Abdullah the Butcher a little bit, so there's that. He was a Canadian guy who, after about 6 years, ventured down to Mexico, and that's where he really started to make his name. It's where he really started scaring people. Being such an intriguing character in Mexico got him some work in Japan, and eventually in 1998, he landed a gig with WCW, which is where most people know him from, although you may have seen him pop up in other places like Wrestling Society X, Lucha Underground, Juggalo Wrestling. I mean, come on, who hasn't seen Juggalo Wrestling, dude? Currently doing stuff with the NWA, and as of press time, has not officially retired as of yet. You go, Vampiro, you go, boy. Number 37, Nails. Born Kevin Wackles in 1958. I mean, come on, the guy's name is Wackles. I mean, come on. Started doing wrestling in about 1982 and 1985. We first saw him in World Class. He did stuff with the AWA in Japan in the early part of his career. From there, he had several on-again, off-again stints with the World Wrestling Federation, including this infamous stint in 1991 as Nails, who was basically an escaped convict. I mean, who hasn't thought about something like this a time or two, right? Some kind of just crazed, escaped prisoner, just out, just like hurting people. I swear this is the basis of like 3 horror movies at least already. The on-screen character, scary enough. Perhaps the man off-screen was even scarier. We know Nails mostly for the infamous story about how he choked Vince McMahon during a contract negotiation. I mean, Vince had strong-armed a lot of boardrooms at that point, but he wasn't quite prepared for that one, wouldn't you think? So he gets in right here on the list at number 37 per special request of Vince McMahon himself. Of course, he never returned to the WWE ever again, but he would pop up sporadically for WCW over the years, and there's some weird cameos there. Number 36, Sue Young. Born Vanera Riggs in 1989, she began wrestling in 2007, got signed to WWE Developmental in 2010. That time was very brief, only lasting a year or so. From there, she hit the independent scene very hard. You follow places like Shimmer, Shine. Her first one-off appearance with TNA was back in 2015, but then in 2018, she became a regular there as well. You've seen her most recently in TNA wrestling as well, although she is currently temporarily inactive. Number 35, Wrath. Brian Clark was born in 1964, and we first saw him appear in the AWA as the Night Stalker in 1989. After AWA folded, he would do a few appearances for WCW, as well as UWF and Smoky Mountain, before his first most famous character kicked in the WWE, which was Adam Bomb. After doing that for a few years, he eventually ended up back in the WCW land. This time he was called upon to be Wrath, which was a member of a little stable with Mortis and James Vandenberg, who of course would feud with WCW's version of Sub-Zero, a man by the name of Glacier. To get all that, after the team broke up, he had a pretty nice little run as a singles guy all on his own, just kind of destroying people, and he was thought to be a credible opponent for Goldberg for a minute. He would later go on to do Chronic with Bryan Adams in WCW. Wrath was probably him at his most scariest. We can lump his other two gimmicks in here as well, as far as the Night Stalker and Adam Bomb. Speaking of his group, number 34, Mortis. Christopher Klusaridis. I probably totally botched that one. Born in 1970, he started wrestling in 1992, bounced around for a couple years, did a bunch of enhancement stuff with WWE in around 94, and then in 95, WCW gave him a shot on the undercard, and I'm talking the undercard. This all, of course, was as Chris Kanyon, but arguably his most famous gimmick here is when they brought him in as Mortis in 1996 to oppose Sub-Zero, Glacier, in WCW's real-life Mortal Kombat. The mask, the stoicism involved, and just the overall presentation of the group, I think made him stand out as a very scary character that they really could have done more with. WCW, of course. And after James Mitchell left, the whole thing was dropped. Wrath kept being Wrath, but Mortis would be put on the sidelines until they just reintroduced him later as just Chris Kanyon, which is who he would remain for the rest of his career. We sadly lost him in 2010 at the age of 40. Number 33, Sabu. Harry Brunk was born in 1964. That is his real name, by the way. You know him as Sabu, and he first began wrestling in 1985, believe it or not. This guy was a very special indie attraction for the first 6 years of his career. You could say his first big break was in the USWA as Samu in 1991. Shortly after that, in 93, WWE took a look at him a few times, but ultimately decided to pass. From there, he went and did stuff in FMW. He was concurrently working in Japan for FMW at the time as well. And you could say that this is where Sabu really started to develop his suicidal, homicidal, genocidal style. He was then brought into ECW, where he definitely made an impression, enough so to where the WCW used him a few times. Ultimately, though, he would pretty much land and stay with ECW around the 1995 year, and this is where his legend really grew and his brand really took on an audience. What makes Sabu scary is his intimidating presence, scars all over his body, and the fact that when you were in the ring with him, you legitimately never knew what he was capable of. That reputation succeeded him so much that I think it maybe prevented him from really being trusted by the big promotions in those days. Even when he was brought into WWE with their relaunch of ECW in the mid-2000s, he was still a wild card even then. Basically, the acorn doesn't fall very far from the tree because number 32, the original Sheik. This just kind of seemed like one of those things where a lot of the Sabu persona comes from, so why wouldn't he be ranked just a spot above Sabu, you know what I mean? I'm not going to pretend like I spent my whole lifetime watching the guy's work. In fact, he was quite before my time. A lot of people probably know him from his time working for Vince Sr. or his time in Japan. It's probably his two most famous runs that he had. Born in 1926 as Edward Farhat. By far, probably the oldest person on this list. We did lose him in 2003 at the age of 76. Number 31, Luna Vachon. Gertrude Vachon was born in 1962. She first started wrestling in 1985, but more than likely you know her from her WWE run, which started right around 1993. The look, the actions, the family tree. That, for starters, right there. And I think we can all agree pretty much the measuring stick for scary women wrestlers in general. I believe this is the highest you're going to see one of them on this list. And the female delegation has been represented quite well here on the 100 Scariest Wrestlers list. We try not to discriminate here. She also did a little WCW stuff, and then she found her way back to the WWE. She had her last match in 2007, and we sadly lost her in 2010. If I had a nickel for every time that I've said we've sadly lost this person on this list, man, I'd have a scary amount of nickels. Number 30, Baron von Raschke. Born James Raschke in 1940, he began wrestling in 1966. This guy worked pretty much everywhere over the course of his career. More modern fans will probably remember him from his late days in his career in the AWA, and what made him scary was his voice, his overall presentation, and not to forget, the claw, a tactic still used by many parents to this day. Number 29, Relic. Jonathan Hugger was born in 1977. That is his real name, by the way, Hugger. He started wrestling in 1999. He's probably more famously known as Johnny the Bull Stamboli. There was a brief period of time in TNA wrestling where he was someone called Relic, which is killer spelled backwards. Get it? Gotta be one of the scariest, freaky looking wrestlers of all time. The presentation was good. Problem was it was just so TNA. Johnny the Bull had his last match in 2014, so he's been retired for over 10 years now. Number 28, Black Rain. We talked about Dustin Runnels earlier on this countdown as Gold Dust and also as Seven. Either way, this was a gimmick he used for a very brief period of time in TNA wrestling. Scary face paint, check. Huge pet rat, check. Although it was brief, still made an impact. See what I did there? And created a ton of nightmares. Man, I would really like to hear a Dustin Runnels book sometime, because some of the things that have came from the mind of that guy are just fascinating. Number 27, Doink the Clown. This character was originally played by Matt Bourne, then they transitioned it off to Fabulous One Steve Kern. This induction will center around Matt Bourne specifically, as his twisted version of Doink the Clown is the one that deserves to be on this list, and not the cheesy PG version of his gimmick that was done by Kern. Bourne would also further experiment with the gimmick a little bit in ECW and beyond after his WWE time was up. This guy's got a whole Dark Side of the Ring episode dedicated to him, so that's also pretty scary. There are two kinds of people in this world, those who love clowns and those who don't. My wife hates them. You do the math. Number 26, Terry Funk. I mean, at this point, I don't think you can even call yourself a wrestling fan unless you know who Terry Funk is. This will be kind of a controversial choice on the list, because this isn't your traditional scary person. This isn't someone out there with face paint or a mask. This is just someone who legitimately displayed craziness throughout his whole career. He wrestled everywhere and was unpredictable while doing so. You never knew what he was going to do. Heck, he might even come at you with his Texas branding iron at full force. I mean, it's Terry Funk. Enough said. Number 25, New Jack. New Jack was born Jerome Young in 1963. He began wrestling in 1992, and for a while he was a normal enough wrestler. Somewhere along the way, he turned into one of the gangstas, and over time developed an unpredictable persona. Most famous for his time in ECW, New Jack would run to the ring brandishing a trash can full of weapons. You just never knew what these weapons were going to be. Could be a stapler, could be a fork, could be a keyboard. So many random things were used. Just imagine standing across the ring from this guy. And infamous stories surround his legend. Stories like the mass transit incident, where a 17-year-old kid lied about his age and ended up in a wrestling match with New Jack, where New Jack proceeded to cut the ever-living daylights out of his face. You never really knew what you were getting into with New Jack. Just ask Vic Grimes
times. Sadly, we lost him in 2021 at age 58. Number 24, Cactus Jack. Mick Foley was so good at being scary and is so legendary that he gets a couple different spots on this list. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Foley developed this Cactus Jack persona. For a while there, the full name was Cactus Jack Manson. So that ought to tell you something. For starters, Cactus Jack would do crazier and crazier things, all kinds of things to invoke pain on himself and others, synonymous with the King of the Deathmatch tournament, and even a more tamed down version of the gimmick appeared in the WWE throughout the years, but it's still just crazy enough. And I mean, just take a look at this guy. He wasn't like the other kids. Number 23, Demon Finn Balor. Fergal Devitt was born in 1981. He started wrestling in around 2001. First started going to Japan in around 2006, which is where he would really make a name for himself, and it's where this gimmick first was basically created while he was still under his Prince Devitt name. For larger matches, Devitt would paint himself up in this demon-like character, and when he signed to WWE, this was a tradition he continued, albeit under this different name, Finn Balor. It's really weird to think that now he's been Finn Balor for basically longer than he ever was Prince Devitt. Seems like a distant memory. Balor will bring this persona out for special big matches, and deservedly so. Scary face paint, check. Scary headdress, check. Scary dance moves, check. I mean, what else do you need? Number 22, Abyss. Born Christopher Park in 1973, you could trace the beginning of his career all the way back to the year 1995. Did a lot of indie stuff, and then he ended up in IWA Puerto Rico and sometime around 2002, and was pretty much there from day one at the startup of TNA Wrestling. This is going all the way back to the Asylum days. A huge, scary monster that we wouldn't hear talk for a very long time. It's a simple formula, really. Be huge and scary, don't talk, destroy people. That's pretty much the how to be a scary wrestler handbook right there. They would do the Abyss gimmick for quite a while, but they would also have him bounce out of that and be a different character named Joseph Park. I was never a huge fan of this stuff, be that as it may. Abyss deserves to be here, as he held it down for monsters. Was probably the scariest, most intimidating wrestler as far as menacing abilities go that wasn't on the WWE roster throughout the 2000s. He had his last match at this point in 2019, so many would say retired. He's currently working as an agent in WWE. Fun fact, little trivia for you there. Number 21, Killer Kowalski. You know, one thing I'll admit about putting this list together is that maybe, just maybe, we could have dug a little bit deeper into history. I tried to represent at least a few historical wrestling figures on here. Be that as it may, here's Killer Kowalski. Born Edward Spolnick in 1926, he became a wrestler in 1947. We're talking this guy wrestled for 38 years before I was even born. He was intimidating and scary because of his look, and also mainly because of his in-ring style. Hence the name Killer. And back in those days, if you earned the nickname Killer, I think it would be something that should be taken pretty seriously. His first retirement was in 1977, started a wrestling school, trained some pretty famous wrestlers that would come up over the years. You may have heard of some people like Triple H, Chyna, Big John Studd, Tommaso Ciampa, and this is just scratching the surface. We lost Kowalski in the year of 2008 at age 81. Number 20, Gangrel / The Brood. David Heath was born in 1969. He began wrestling in 1987. In 1998, he showed up as a character named Gangrel in the WWE. Before this, he was making a name for himself on the indies as Vampire Warrior. That's neither here nor there. What made this guy scary is that he was a vampire, obviously. He drank blood during every entrance. Then we found out that in real life, he was married to Luna Vachon, and so that's another point for scariness right there. He brought Edge and Christian along for the ride, and they formed a stable called the Brood. Instead of there being one vampire, now there's 3 vampires, man. They were also scary because, you know, they would just be vampires and do, like, you know, I don't know, Lost Boys stuff. Gangrel's WWE run ended in 2001, but they brought him back a few times over the years. He consistently worked on the independent circuit, especially here on the West Coast, which is awesome. Has worked as a trainer over the years, still technically currently active. We last saw him pop up randomly in All Elite Wrestling. Who knows when we'll see him again. Number 19, Andre the Giant. This is someone that would probably be traditionally overlooked in a lot of lists like this, but you can't deny the sheer size, the sheer monstrosity. Did I say sheer enough times? The inherent Superman Colossus-like strength and ability of Andre the Giant. The man literally owned the wrestling business because no one else could tell him that he did it. And that's really all I got to say about that. Number 18, Norman the Lunatic. This one I fought to have high on this list just because it's a little bit of a personal thing for me. I did a video about wrestlers that ruined my childhood, link in the description, and Norman the Lunatic was a huge part of that for me personally. We covered him earlier as Bastion Booger. What made Norman the Lunatic scary was, of course, his look. I mean, imagine meeting up with this guy in a back alley somewhere. Also, his actions and his name, they both kind of go hand in hand. It says it all right there. Lunatic. 502, don't be blue. That's what he used to say. I don't know. Look it up. Number 17, Demolition. This also throws back to my own personal beliefs right here. Nothing scared the crap out of me more as a young wrestling fan than Demolition. I mean, just take a look at these guys. I don't know what was scarier, the bondage masks that they would come out to the ring in, or the face paint that would be revealed thereafter. Like a scary sandwich of things. Started out with Axe and Smash, but then they added a third guy, Rush. If we weren't scary enough, here comes a third guy into the mix to ruin your nightmares and your dream. And as far as if we're putting them up against the Road Warriors, as far as pure scariness, I think Demolition takes the cake. I don't know. Maybe they shouldn't have been so far apart on the list, but just me personally, I was always scared of Demolition. Road Warriors, not so much. Maybe because I always saw them as good guys, so it was a lot less scary. That makes sense. Number 16, Bray Wyatt. Wyndham Rotunda, rest his soul. We talked about the Wyatt family as a whole earlier. I just thought that the guy deserved his own induction separately, a little bit higher on the list here, because let's face it, from top to bottom, from a wrestling promo and a presentation standpoint, I don't know if anyone's done it better in the last 20, 30 years or so than the Bray Wyatt character itself. And if we're going to be more specific, this would be basically from when the character first started all the way up until when the Fiend stuff started happening. Hard to find the words, but the guy will definitely be missed. One of the best to ever do it. It goes without saying that what made him scary, of course, were his presence, his promos. You could even put the look into there. Definitely think I made my case on this one. We lost him here in this year of 2023. Number 15, the Great Muta. I don't want to mess up his name, but he was born in 1962. He began wrestling in 1984. American audiences first got to see him in Texas in 1988, and then on an even bigger scale in 1989 through World Championship Wrestling. And what made him scary, of course, was the fact that he didn't talk, check. Spooky face paint, check. Oh yeah, and blow in the mist, check. See the Great Kabuki, who we inducted earlier. Very similar presentation as far as that goes. I would argue that Muta got to do this on a way larger scale, and it was basically the most people that had seen that character presented in that sort of way at that time. And that run was actually pretty short, and then he returned to Japan after that, where he lived out a legendary career. WCW did have him back in the NWO days, but it wasn't really quite the same. He was part of NWO Japan, though. He never ended up working for the E, but they did induct him into the Hall of Fame recently. So yeah, Muta, go figure. Not Wheeler Yuta, Great Muta. Number 14, The Missing Link. We're digging deep now, huh guys? Bet no one saw this one coming. Byron Robertson was born in 1939. Holy smokes. He first began wrestling in the year of 1961. For a lot of his career, he wrestled as Crusader Robertson. In 1983, he adopted the gimmick of Max the Missing Link, and just a couple years later, under Vince McMahon in the WWE, he dropped the Max part and just became the Missing Link. It was short-lived though, as he ended up in World Class right after that. He officially retired in 1996, but right before his death had unretired and had did some stuff on the indies. What made him scary, of course, was his look, his menacing presence, as well as his actions. That's kind of the holy trinity of scariness, if you will. We lost him in 2007 at the age of 68, but he'll always be remembered here as the 14th scariest wrestler of all time. Number 13, the Boogeyman. Martin Wright was born in 1964, and he entered the world of wrestling, oddly enough, through Tough Enough. This was in the year 2004, and even though that didn't really work out, he still ended up getting a developmental contract with the WWE and reporting to Ohio Valley Wrestling. There he developed this character of the Boogeyman, and the way that they did this character, it got over absolutely huge in Ohio Valley Wrestling. Then they zapped him up to the main roster, where he started haunting people on the grand scale on WWE programming. Obviously, we've got the look here, we've got the actions, we've got the fact that he ate worms. If there was ever going to be a perfect Boogeyman, I can't think of a better one than this guy right here, which I guess is saying a lot, but also nothing at the same time. Number 12, Jake the Snake Roberts. Born in 1955, Jake started wrestling in 1974. In 1983, he started to get pretty popular in Georgia Championship Wrestling. From there, the WWE came calling, and this is where he developed the grand character known as Jake the Snake Roberts. This is one of our earliest instances. Jake was very special because he was an anti-hero in a time in the 80s when there really wasn't a such thing. And even though for most of his career there, he was mainly thought of as a good guy, his presence, his promos, and having the snake also made him scary. So when he went to the dark side, we all knew that we were really screwed, because now the guy that we all liked with the snake is not such a good guy anymore, is he? And I would argue solely for his high placement or his attachment to one of the most gruesome angles of all time, when he unleashed his cobra on Randy Savage's arm. I think I've pled my case. Number 11, Kevin Sullivan. Sullivan was born in 1949 and began wrestling in 1970. His career was normal enough for a while, and then at some point in time, he got into Satanism, I guess. I don't know. There was stuff like this and his masked Lucifer character. Also later on in WCW as the Taskmaster had shades of this as well. And that's mainly what we'll focus on here, since that has such a broad audience. Might be kind of cheesy because it was with the Dungeon of Doom, but come on. At the time, I'll admit, seemed silly and ridiculous. Still would seem silly and ridiculous to someone watching it now with no subtext or context. But when you know what internet wrestling dwellers like myself know about Kevin Sullivan, I mean, who hasn't went down the YouTube rabbit hole about Kevin Sullivan, Chris Benoit, all that different stuff? The fact that he's linked to all that, even in just the most basic way of being the guy that Nancy Benoit left to go marry Chris. I don't know, man, to each their own, but I just find it interesting how these characters seep into the wrestling business, and the promoters are like, yeah, I think it's a good idea to have a Satan type character in there, yeah. And then I guess it just makes it weirder that the guy portraying that character is always in real life like, yeah, I worship Satan. Does no one think that that's weird? We are finally crossing that finish line. The X on the map has been pinpointed, and the Holy Grail is on the horizon. We are down to the final 10, the top 10, if you will, of the 100 scariest wrestlers of all time. It's been quite the journey so far. Before we hop into it, let's give you the whole list. Here's all 90 that we got so far. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hit notifications, and please leave a like before you go. The time is nigh. Let's do this. Number 10, Mankind. We had Mick Foley on the countdown earlier as Cactus Jack, and as scary as the Cactus Jack character was and is, I think you have to give the nod to the Mankind character as Mick Foley's scariest character. Why? Well, let's start with the name, Mankind. Just weird. It was like he was speaking for all mankind. Next thing we'll talk about is the mask. It's like Foley went in there and said, hey, I'd like a deranged jockstrap look. Also, you had the fact that they would emphasize that it was missing part of his ear, creepy vignettes and promos, check, and you combine that with the wrestling style that Foley had already as Cactus Jack, and you can make the argument that he took all that a step further with Mankind. Just look at Hell in the Cell 1998, and that should be reason enough. We love you, Mick Foley. Number 9, Kane. Glenn Jacobs was born in 1967. He began wrestling in 1992, originally as Angus King. He bounced around the Southern Territories like USWA and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and I think he was always kind of on the WWE's radar. They brought him in, took a look at him. At first, they decided to package him as Isaac Yankem DDS, but that, of course, lamed out. From there, he went back to the USWA and stuff like that while they kind of ironed out and figured out something else to do with him. Them meaning the WWE, obviously. They even brought him back up as the fake Kevin Nash, the fake Diesel at one point, which we won't talk about that. But then he got repackaged as Kane, Undertaker's long-lost brother, who was burned in a fire that apparently was Undertaker's fault. This led to about a 5-month storyline, which finally culminated in his debut, and I think what was supposed to be just kind of a spot character, amazingly enough, turned into something that gave the guy almost a 20-year run in the business. Through several different incarnations, talking, not talking. What made Kane scary, of course, was his mask, and either his non-words or words, depending on which version of Kane you got. His origin story is scary in of itself, and now he's the mayor of Knox County in Tennessee, so for some reason that's scary to me too. Number 8, George the Animal Steele. Born William Myers in 1937, he began wrestling in 1960, and what made him scary, of course, was his presence as well as his mannerisms. That was probably the most important thing. And let's not forget the look. He basically looked like one of your weird uncles after he had had a little bit too much to drink. This guy's scariness transcended wrestling, so much so that he actually starred in quite a few Hollywood movies, mainly the movie Ed Wood, if you want to check that out. Kind of weird, as he played a scary guy on TV, but in real life was a devout Christian that believed in God and went to church, so take that for what you will. He all the way retired in the year 2000, and he went to that big wrestling ring in the sky in 2017 at the ripe young age of 79. Number 7, Papa Shango. Charles Wright was born in 1961 and began his wrestling career in 1989. By 1991, he had caught the attention of the World Wrestling Federation. They brought him in, looked at him, then Vince McMahon tried to shape him in his own image, and that image would be Papa Shango, who was scary because of his look with his threads and the face paint, and the fact that he was some sort of voodoo priest, which that fact was lost on me as a child. I kind of just looked at him as kind of like how a lot of kids would have looked at the boogeyman in the 2000s. But there was that time he made Ultimate Warrior puke all over himself, as well as made his forehead bleed. This solidified his place in wrestling fans' nightmares, for better or for worse. Mr. Wright would go on to several different, albeit more successful gimmicks, but this was the one that scared people the most. Number 6, the Black Scorpion. Hear me out, okay? The promos themselves were scary, and the promos themselves are right enough for them to deserve to be on this list all alone. Sting, I have a present for you, Sting. Something that absolutely haunted my dreams for years as a child, so partial credit for this goes to Ole Anderson as the voice of those promos, as well as whoever helped produce these things. Not so much credit, though, goes to the actual Black Scorpion portrayal in real life. which ended up to be Ric Flair in a mask, ended up being kind of lame in execution. Either way, I believe it deserves to be here. Number 5, the Ultimate Warrior. Hear me out, okay? Warrior was scary, even though he was a good guy. I mean, take a look at this guy. He definitely wasn't like the other kids. Born James Hellwig in 1959, he began bodybuilding at an early age and parlayed that into a wrestling career by the year of 1985. Early on, known as Blade Runner Rock and the Blade Runners tag team, along with Blade Runner Sting, he then stormed through World Class a couple years later, and then on to the WWE, where he was repackaged as the Ultimate Warrior. So the look and the sheer physique is number 1. If we want to throw the face paint in there, that's number 2. Number 3, and probably most important in this case with Warrior, was the promos. The way the Warrior would almost speak through the camera right into your living room would send chills up and down your spine. And extra bonus points if you could actually figure out anything he was actually talking about ever. That sort of thing is unsettling. That sort of thing is scary. Case closed. Number 4, Kamala. Here comes Kamala with a mouse. One of my earliest memories right there. No, not Kamala Harris, Kamala the wrestler. James Harris was born in 1950 and he began wrestling in the year 1978. Just imagine being a kid and this guy coming across your screen, okay? With the look making him scary, you double down on that with the actions. You actually 100% believe that they pulled this guy out of an African jungle somewhere and just let him loose in a wrestling ring. We figured such things were totally possible in the 1980s. Guy worked everywhere, did everything, scared everyone, everywhere along the way. He officially retired in 2010 and went to that great wrestling ring in the sky in 2020 at the age of 70. Number 3, Abdullah the Butcher. This was really hard for me. At one point, I did have Abby all the way at number 1. Born Lawrence Shreve in 1941, he began wrestling in 1958. It wasn't long into his career for him to create this Abdullah the Butcher, the character for himself, and that's what he made a career out of. What made Abdullah the Butcher scary was his look, obviously, the sheer size of the man, and as the years went by, the more and more scars that he would collect on his body were also intimidating. You couple that with the thoughts and the facts of what he could actually do to you in the ring, completely unpredictable. He also spoke in a way that was very terrifying, and while the promos may not have been literary works of art, they were definitely effective at getting their point across and scaring the living daylights of young wrestling fans, and I'm sure even some older wrestling fans. For years and years and years, this guy did it. He had his last match in 2010. A national treasure to us, Abdullah the Butcher is. Number 2, The Undertaker. This is another real hard one because you definitely can make the argument for Undertaker to be number 1. Everyone in this top 3 to me is pretty much interchangeable, but for the purposes of this list, I've got Taker at number 2. Born Mark Calloway in 1965, he began training in 1986 and officially debuted in 1987. He floundered around for a few years, but did get some experience in a lot of key places like World Championship Wrestling and Japan. In 1990, he found his new home with the World Wrestling Federation and the man that would become his pseudo-father, Vince McMahon. When he debuted, he was very scary, even though I wasn't particularly scared of him at first. The more and more this character went on and developed, the scarier it got. You add Paul Bearer as his manager, which may have been the scariest thing about it all. He starts putting people in caskets all the time. I mean, as a kid, it's hard to even come to grips with what death actually is, and here's this guy on our TV on this wrestling program putting people in caskets. Man, maybe that's why I'm scarred for life. After a few years, Taker would come to the lighter side of things, and he would use his evil for more good. So it'd be a little less scary there for a bit, because for a while he was on our side. But I'd be a failure if I did not mention his late 90s transition into his satanic priest Ministry of Darkness gimmick. That was pretty scary, the fact that he was crucifying people on his Undertaker symbol each week. I mean, one time he tried to embalm Stone Cold Steve Austin. It stacks up, the numbers add up. The Undertaker is our number 2. Good job, Take. All right, folks, here we are. Without any further ado, here it is. Number 1, The Fiend. We talked about Bray Wyatt earlier. We talked about the Wyatt family earlier. And as scary as all that was, the man, the myth, the legend, Wyndham Rotunda, took all that a step further for us and created a character named The Fiend. I think when it's all said and done and we look back at the history of wrestling, I don't know if you're going to have another guy that ever put so much mental energy and thought into a character as Bray Wyatt, Wyndham Rotunda, whatever you want to call it, as this man put into The Fiend. The entire presentation of everything, I think, was excellently crafted, and when it comes right down to it, it's very, very sad that we will never ever get to see more of it. The tie-in between the character that he would portray in the Firefly Funhouse, the transition into The Fiend, and back and forth therein some, I think for a good couple years there was some of the best stuff we would get on WWE TV from a promo standpoint. Let's not forget about the character itself and all the things that made The Fiend scary, which of course would be the look, the very intricate mask, coupled with that entrance was nothing short of something straight out of a nightmare. You add that with the mannerisms, we wouldn't get promos from the guy. He never talked, which when it's all said and done, thank goodness that WWE never got to the point where they decided to do that with him. The connection between the normal Bray Wyatt and The Fiend, something that was truly unique and special, and I don't know if it'll ever be pulled off quite as well ever again. History right before our very eyes, and sadly I don't think enough people appreciated it at the time, and there's a lot of people that even want to go back in retrospect and not appreciate it now, even though that we've lost Mr. Rotunda. Be that as it may, he will always be iconicized and immortalized right here as the #1 scariest wrestler in all of professional wrestling history. Holy smokes, I can't believe we did it. We got through all 100 of those things somehow, some way. I made all these videos. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Thank you very much for joining us. That was quite a list. I know there may be a few I left out. If you can think of any, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching and joining us here. My name is The Brand. This is Pro Wrestling Planet. Hope you enjoyed your stay, and I hope that you'll join us again sometime soon. The best way to do that is to go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you know what's going on. That's all I ask. Please leave a like on your way out. We'll see you next time right here, right now on Pro Wrestling Planet.
Arriba! This is WWE legend, Hall of Famer Tito Santana, and you are watching Pro Wrestling Planet. Does not get any better than this. Arriba!